Hi, everyone, and welcome to this additional training as part of the Illinois Shines Project Application Process and Portal Deep Dive Part 1. In today's session, we are going to explain expanded systems, co-located systems, and size changes to systems. Starting with expansions and co-location. An expansion is a system addition to an already Illinois Shines contracted project, while co-location occurs when there is more than one system enrolled in the Illinois Shines program at a single location that belongs to the same entity or its affiliates. For example, 3 individual 100 kilowatt systems at a single parcel would be considered one 300 kilowatt co-located system. On the left-hand side are characteristics of a system expansion, and on the right-hand side are characteristics of co-located systems, since expansions and co-located systems can sometimes get confused. Starting with expansions. Expansions are only compensated up to the maximum 5 megawatts total size limit when added to the original system. An expansion must have the same interconnection point as the original system. That's a key characteristic of an expansion. The price of the expansion system is based on the combined size and the group and block of the individual expansion system. So the group and block of the addition, not the original system. An expansion will not be Part 1 verified until the original system is Part 2 verified first. And expansions must be separately enrolled in net metering with the utility. Now, looking at co-locations. Also, total capacity of co-located projects cannot exceed 5 megawatts. Alternatively, co-located projects must have separate interconnection points, so each system functions independent of each other. This is a key characteristic of co-location. Both projects will receive co-location pricing. Co-location pricing can be found in the guidebook. If 2 projects enter the contract at the same time, both projects will receive co-located REC pricing from the REC price table in the guidebook. However, if a co-located project enters contract after its co-located pair, a price reduction will be applied to the second project, with the first project receiving full standard REC pricing so that the total of the 2 systems equals co-located pricing. Now moving on to system resizing. The program recognizes that changes may happen during the development process, which is typically between the Part 1 application, when the proposed nameplate capacity is submitted, and the Part 2 application, when the actual nameplate capacity is submitted. Some resizing changes are permitted during that time, while some resizing changes would lead to a removal of the project from the REC contract. Any change in nameplate capacity between Part 1 and Part 2 application that exceeds 5 kilowatts or 25% of the nameplate capacity, whichever of the 2 is larger, would be removed from the contract and would need to reapply. For example, if a 10 kilowatt system changed by 6 kilowatts, that would exceed the 5 kilowatt maximum change. But if a 100 kilowatt system changed by 30 kilowatts, then that would exceed the 25% maximum change. So it's whichever of the 2 is larger. Outlined here are a few scenarios of what happens if actual nameplate capacity is different than the proposed nameplate capacity in the Part 1 application. The first 2 scenarios are if a change happens within the 5 kilowatt or 25% threshold and the size category does not change. That's an acceptable change. The second 2 scenarios are if a change happens within the 5 kilowatt or 25% threshold and the size category does change. That's still acceptable, just the REC price might be adjusted to reflect the new size category. And then the final 2 are if the size change exceeds that 5 kilowatt or 25% threshold, then the project will be removed from the REC contract and will need to reapply. Any changes to a project after Part 2 is verified would need to be submitted as an expansion or could constitute a violation of the REC contract. This slide will review development timelines, energization deadlines, and extensions to those deadlines. Each project that participates in the Illinois Shines program and is Part 1 verified is required to be energized within a certain time frame from the date that the project has been approved for a REC contract. Energization, by the Illinois Shines program definition, means the project has been developed, energized, and Part 2 verified by the program administrator. The energization deadline can be found in the project Schedule A, and the deadline is dependent on the date of the ICC's approval of the project for a REC contract and the development timeline. The energization deadline is important because if a project is not energized or does not request an extension prior to the project's scheduled energization date, the project will be canceled and removed from the contract. However, if a project is not expected to be energized by its scheduled energization date, an extension request may be made to the IPA, which we'll discuss in the next slide. As previously mentioned, the energization deadline is dependent on the date of the ICC's approval of the project for a REC contract and the development timeline. On the bottom, we have the development timelines for the various contracts and project types. For the 2022 REC contract, the development timeline is 18 months for DG projects and 24 months for community solar projects. For example, if you have a 2022 REC contract for a DG project, you would have 18 months from the trade date or the date of the ICC approval to develop, energize, and have the project Part 2 approved. Finally, if you won't be meeting that energization deadline, you will need to follow the process outlined for an extension request. A formal extension request is created by the approved vendor and sent to the IPA and the contracting utility. Approved vendors are encouraged to submit extension requests at least 5 business days ahead of the deadline. Extension requests are brief and include the justification for the request, information about the project and contract, and the length of extension request. The IPA will review the extension request, and when the extension is granted, the IPA will formally notify the approved vendor prior to the scheduled energization date. Finally, the program administrator will generate a revised Schedule A with the project's new scheduled energization date, which the AV will now be beholden to. Thank you very much for following along, and feel free to reach out to the Illinois Shines program administrator with any questions.